Hi, I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna Ơi. One of the main reasons why I started this channel is because I see so much misinformation and misunderstanding about my country, Vietnam. Usually, this means debunking misinformation and distortion by anti-communist Western media and NGOs. But unfortunately, sometimes I also see misinformation and misunderstanding coming from Western leftists on social media. And one of the most misunderstood aspects of the socialist ideology of Vietnam is our nationalism. To many Western leftists, the word nationalism is automatically a dirty word associated with right-wing fascists who believe their nation is superior to other nations. This is one form of nationalism, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the nationalism of many movements of indigenous, colonized, and oppressed peoples, including Vietnam. So, I want to say this right away. The nationalism I am discussing today is not the same thing at all as right-wing nationalism. You know, some people say,
the Nazis were National Socialists, that means socialism is bad.
You know how ridiculous and annoying that is? Well, that's how Vietnamese communists feel when we hear people say,
the Nazis were National Socialists, that means nationalism is bad.
If you insist that right-wing nationalism and Vietnamese and other forms of left-wing nationalism are the same thing just because they are both called nationalism, then I guess you think black pepper and chili pepper are the same. And I guess you think the Eiffel Tower can be found in Paris Hilton. It's like saying right-wing libertarianism and libertarian socialism are the same, or anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism are the same thing. They are not the same at all. So let's talk about left-wing and indigenous nationalism and the nationalism of Vietnam. Hopefully after watching this video, you will have a better understanding and you will know that our nationalism has nothing in common with right-wing nationalism. In fact, they are total opposites. But before I begin talking about Vietnamese nationalism, I should probably define what right-wing nationalism is, just so you can tell the difference. Right-wing nationalism is a chauvinistic belief that one's nation is superior to other nations. It means putting the interests of your own nation above the interests of other nations, and seeing nationality as the most defining aspect of one's identity. This kind of chauvinistic nationalism is usually tied to exceptionalism, the belief that one's nation is somehow exceptional, or gifted with some unique quality that makes it better than any other nation. Of course, that means that right-wing nationalists also usually believe that other nations are inferior, which has often used as justification for colonizing, exploiting, and oppressing other nations. So now that you understand the right-wing nationalism, let's take a look at the leftist nationalist philosophy of Ho Chi Minh. As you probably already know, Ho Chi Minh was Vietnam's communist leader who led the two biggest resistance wars of Vietnam against colonialist France and imperialist USA. Because of his very important role in the communist movement, both in Vietnam and internationally, the story of Ho Chi Minh has been distorted by anti-communists from all over the world. One of the most common ways of distorting the truth about Ho Chi Minh is to distort his nationalism. Some anti-communists try to paint Ho Chi Minh as almost exclusively a nationalist, downplaying his communist ideology, as was the case with the armchair historian's quote-unquote history of the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective.
As he himself stated, at first patriotism, not yet communism. America never fully grasped that it was the desire for liberty, not communism, that motivated the North Vietnamese to fight on against the odds.
The idea is to make it seem like Ho Chi Minh didn't really care about communism. He was really guided by nationalism. This is because anti-communists don't want you to believe that communism was really that popular in Vietnam. They don't want you to believe that a communist could have been as universally respected as Ho Chi Minh. But as we will see later in this video, Ho Chi Minh's nationalism was intrinsically tied with communism, and all his philosophies were built on the foundation of Marxist-Leninist communist ideology. Another way that anti-communists and even many leftists try to attack Ho Chi Minh is by saying that he was a right-wing ultra-nationalist and that his branch of nationalism was exactly the same as the nationalism of fascists and bourgeois conservatives. Again, this is completely absurd, as the nationalism of Ho Chi Minh has absolutely nothing to do with a belief in the superiority of Vietnam over other nations, nor the chauvinist notion that Vietnam is exceptional. These attacks extend to Vietnamese people in general. And in fact, I'm often attacked by Western leftists as an
ultra-nationalist pretending to be communist just like Ho Chi Minh.
Well, as much as I am flattered to be compared to Uncle Ho, I am afraid that this statement is just complete nonsense. If you know anything at all about Vietnamese nationalism, if you look at the history of Vietnam, you will see that Vietnam has been a victim of oppressive right-wing nationalism for centuries. White supremacist French colonialists conquered and enslaved Vietnamese people for over a century as a result of French colonialist nationalism. Fascist Japan ruthlessly plundered from our nation and drove us into famine because of their fascist nationalism. The USA committed genocide against Vietnam in an invasionary war that killed 2 million Vietnamese civilians with napalm, carpet bombing of population centers, and illegal chemical weapons like Agent Orange for well over a decade because of capitalist imperialist nationalism. Whenever nations are brutally dominated and oppressed like Vietnam was, that is when we develop a need for left-wing nationalism. As Kwame Ture, a prominent organizer in the civil rights movement in the United States and the global Pan-African movement, explains.
Nationalism, of course, must be properly understood. We left this one for last. In Europe, their formation and their political formation started with nations and went to state structures. Colonized countries start from state structures and go to nations. The difference must be properly appreciated. If one already has a nation and one is going to a state, there's no need to use nationalism. As a matter of fact, here it will lead to chauvinism. But if one has a state structure and one is trying to build a nation, one has to use nationalism. For example, if one would look at the formation of European states, even Germany, France, England, one would see that the nations themselves already began to have formation before they went to state structure. If one would look at Africa today, if one would look at South and Central America today, if one would look at Asia today, one would see what they really have is state structures which they had to fight for against colonialism. In fact, they inherited the state structures of the colonial power, and they're now building a nation. Therefore, they must use nationalism to build it up. When the indigenous people of Hawaii seize state power in Hawaii, they will have to use nationalism to bring back Hawaiians to be proud of Hawaii, to be proud of the tradition, to use their culture, etc., etc. Therefore, here, nationalism is necessary.
What Ture is talking about here might be difficult for people living in developed Western capitalist imperialist nations to understand, because your histories are so different from our histories in the colonized global South. Africa, Asia, South America, and indigenous people all over the world have had state structures imposed on us by your imperialist, colonialist nations, and our own cultural natural identities were severely suppressed. In Vietnam, our native culture was severely suppressed and obliterated by French colonizers, and the French tried to strip all national identity away from us. They called our country French Indochina and lumped us together with Laos and Cambodia as their colonial subjects. They saw us as little more than slaves and resources to be used and discarded. Our humanity was withheld from us under French colonial rule, while the French themselves used their subjugation of the Vietnamese to bolster their own national identity as conquerors and quote-unquote civilizers. In this context, Vietnamese people came to yearn from our own freedom, our own self-determination, and the freedom to express ourselves and our culture without such subjugation. In these circumstances, the desire of a colonized people for freedom, independence, and self-determination is what we call nationalism. It's simply the desire to not be subjugated by others, to not be conquered and exploited, to not have our culture and our self-expression ripped away from us. That is leftist liberation nationalism. And that was the nationalism of Ho Chi Minh. That was the nationalism that Vietnamese people like my grandfather and millions of others fought and died for. The nationalism of freedom and independence.
Chiến tranh có thể kéo dài 5 năm, 10 năm, 20 năm, song nhân dân Việt Nam quyết không sợ. Không có gì quý hơn độc lập tự do.
We, the left-wing nationalists, do not think that we are superior. We do not think that our countries are better. We just want other countries to stop oppressing and exploiting our people. That is our nationalism, and that is what you must understand. Sadly, many leftists, especially from the West, terribly lack knowledge about this. All they encounter their whole life is right-wing fascistic nationalism. To them, nationalism just means right-wing nationalism. Why do you think this way? Well, it's because the right-wing nationalists get so much national attention. White supremacists get all the media attention, all the platforms, all the freedom they want to express and articulate their own ideas of nationalism. But how often do you see indigenous people expressing ourselves? How often do you hear directly from Vietnamese people like me? From indigenous Hawaiians like Silver Spook? From Pan-Africanists like Kwame Ture? Maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop telling Black and indigenous people what we mean when we say nationalism, and start listening to us explaining what we mean instead. It's very strange for me to see liberals, anti-communists, and even many leftists in the West suddenly joining the same team attack Black people, indigenous people, and countries like Vietnam, Cuba, and Laos. And why? Because we want your Western imperialist countries to leave us alone. That desire which we call nationalism. And you want to take even that desire for freedom and independence from your nations away from us? In Vietnamese, the word nationalism is chủ nghĩa yêu nước. This is usually translated as nationalism or sometimes as patriotism. Ho Chi Minh, in his lifetime, wrote and talked extensively about chủ nghĩa yêu nước. Now let's see what he actually said. From the very beginning of his political journey, Ho Chi Minh was interested in liberating the people of Vietnam. Yes, that much is very clear. But he was also an internationalist, and that's one of the things you have to understand about leftist liberation nationalism. While right-wing chauvinist nationalism directly opposed internationalism, left-wing nationalism has a dialectically productive relationship with internationalism. In other words, our nationalism goes hand in hand with internationalism, because what we want is for all people to be free from oppression by external nations. In the 1920s, while living in France, Ho Chi Minh wrote extensively about the oppression of the colonized peoples of the French Empire from an internationalist perspective. In a 1923 article in a French newspaper called Oppression Hits All Races, Ho Chi Minh wrote,
"All the martyrs of the working class, those in Lausanne like those in Paris, those in Le Havre like those in Martinique, are victims of the same murderer, international capitalism. And it is always in belief in the liberation of their oppressed brothers, without discrimination as to race or country, that the souls of these martyrs will find supreme consolation."
In addition, during this period, Ho Chi Minh wrote many articles about atrocities and suffering in French colonies in Africa, Western Asia, and Northern Africa, not just Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh understood that for the brutally oppressed colonial subjects of the French Empire, nationalism was the gateway into internationalism, and that all the various national independence movements of the empire should be forced together into a wider internationalist movement. In a letter written in 1923 to his fellow activists in France, Ho Chi Minh wrote,
"Even though we are different races, different nationalities, and different religions, we love each other as brothers and sisters. We all bear the same misery, the violence of colonial tyranny. We fight for a common idea, to liberate our compatriots and gain independence for our nations."
Ho Chi Minh even wrote a declaration of the Association of Oppressed Peoples on May 7, 1925, writing,
"If the imperialists oppress us and treat us like animals, it is because we do not unite. If we unite, we become formidable. We are thousands, and our enemies are just a handful in comparison."
But it was not just colonized people that Ho Chi Minh was concerned with. Ho Chi Minh distinguished between national revolutions of the colonized, but saw them as directly linked to the world revolution of the working class. In The Terrible Crimes of French Colonialism in Indochina, written in 1927, Ho Chi Minh called on French workers and colonial subjects to struggle together for revolution.
Vietnam's revolution and the French Revolution must communicate with each other. We must form a tight alliance between the metropolitan proletarian revolution and the national liberation revolutions of colonial subjects. Only this new collaboration will ensure that the international working class wins its final victory.
In The Army Against the Revolution, Ho Chi Minh wrote,
The thing that the working class in France doesn't understand is that capitalism uses its colonies to fight against every liberation movement that you are planning. The French bourgeoisie uses the natives of Africa and Asia to replace white workers. French workers have a duty to act. They must have solidarity with natives. They have to make natives understand that even the workers in France share the same exploitation and slavery and oppression. So we are the same class, and it's time to fight. The two sides together can defeat the same masters which oppress them both. We are brothers, and brothers should not fight each other.
So, you see, Ho Chi Minh's conception of nationalism was completely compatible with internationalism. In fact, to Ho Chi Minh, national liberation hinged entirely with the internationalist cooperation, mutual respect, and solidarity, and the end goal of nationalism was international peace, freedom, and unity, without fear of exploitation of conquest from foreign colonialists. Ho Chi Minh sought to restore pride to the Vietnamese people without resorting to chauvinism or exceptionalism. In 1951, in a report for the Second Congress of our Labour Party, the previous name of our Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh wrote,
Our people have ardent patriotic hearts. It's one of our precious traditions. From time immemorial, every time our motherland was invaded, that spirit became vibrant. It formed a huge and powerful wave. It surmounted all dangers and difficulties. It drowned all the country sellers and country robbers. In our history, there have been many great resistance wars proving the patriotism of our people. We have the right to be proud of the glorious historical pages of the eras of Ba Chung, Ba Chio, Chan Hung Dao, Lê Loi, and Quang Trung. We must remember the merits of national heroes because they represent a heroic nation. Our compatriots today are also very worthy of our ancestors, from gray-haired old people to young children, from overseas compatriots to compatriots in temporarily occupied areas, from people from upland to lowland. Everyone is passionately patriotic and hates the invaders. From soldiers in the front who went hungry for days to stick to the enemy, to destroy them, to civil servants in the rear who fasted to support the army, from women who advised their husbands and children to join the army and who volunteered to help with transportation, to soldiers' mothers who took care of the army like their own children. From male and female workers and peasants emulating to increase production, no matter how hard it is to help a part in the resistance war, to compatriots who donated their land for the government, those noble gestures, though different in their deeds, are the same in their patriotic fervor. Patriotism, like all precious things, sometimes is displayed in glass cabinets, in crystal vases, clearly visible. But sometimes it was hidden in a chest, in a box. It is our duty to make those hidden treasures put on display. That is, we must try our best to explain, propagate, organize, lead, and make everyone's patriotism practice in patriotic work and resistance work.
Notice that Ho Chi Minh's national pride is a pride of sacrifice, a pride of self-defense and self-reliance, a pride in resisting oppression and invasion. It's not a pride in conquest or domination of others. It's not a pride in racial or cultural superiority. It's simply a pride in resilience and self-sacrifice for the greater good. These values are completely different from the nationalist values of right-wingers who talk about the greatness and superiority of their nations over other nations. Ho Chi Minh never talked about Vietnam being superior to other countries because that has never been an aspect of Vietnamese nationalism. And it's vital to understand that Ho Chi Minh's nationalism was inseparably linked to internationalism, as Ho Chi Minh wrote.
Our nationalism is totally different from the nationalism of the reactionary imperialist. It is a part of the international spirit. It was this spirit of nationalism which helped Russian soldiers defeat fascist Japan and fascist Germany. It was this spirit of nationalism which brought victory to the China's Liberation Army against Chiang Kai-shek and the invading American imperialists. It was this spirit of nationalism which allowed the people and army of North Korea, along with the volunteer army from China, to win against imperialist America and its allies. And it is this spirit of nationalism which helps our people and our army to bear the misery, to fight all our enemies, to build an independent and free Vietnam with the dream of building a rich country with a new democracy.
Now, there's still a kind of debate in Vietnam about what word we should use, patriotism or nationalism, when we translate the word chủ nghĩa yêu nước into English. Some English-speaking Vietnamese don't want to use the word nationalism because they are afraid that the West will misunderstand its real meaning. In my opinion, the word patriotism doesn't convey the right meaning, since it simply means love and emotional connection to your country. The word nationalism, on the other hand, has a deeper and wider definition going back centuries, and I think it's much more appropriate as translation of chủ nghĩa yêu nước as we use it in Vietnam. Some people say you should come up with some new word or else people will confuse you for fascists. To which I refer you to Michael Bolton from Office Space.
Why don't you just go by Mike instead of Michael?
No way. Why should I change? He's the one who sucks.
Why the hell should we stop using that word just because a bunch of ignorant Westerners who have no interest in listening to us anyway feel uncomfortable seeing it? It's their problem. They have to deal with it. If they want to learn, we can help educate them. But if they just want to drown in their own ignorance, let them be. It's us who feel sorry for them, not the other way around. And this goes beyond Vietnamese nationalism. Oppressed peoples around the world use the word nationalism to refer to their struggles for liberation. We have Black nationalism, Irish nationalism, Puerto Rico nationalism, and so on. Are you saying that millions of oppressed people all over the world now have to change our language to make our own oppressors feel more comfortable? Let's see what other leftist nationalists have had to say on this subject. First, let's hear from Comrade Fidel Castro, the late communist leader of Cuba, said.
Si nosotros tenemos un día que renunciar a nuestra bandera que tanto amamos, renunciamos y ello hay que hacerlo en aras de la integración y la unidad política de América Latina. Para nosotros eso es un valor trascendente. Como si un día quieren organizar un Estado mundial justo, no un mundo bajo la batuta y el dominio de una superpotencia que quiere establecer el orden. Si un mundo de la humanidad avanzara tanto que en pensar en una integración económica y política universal, nosotros también renunciaríamos a nuestra bandera porque somos internacionalistas. No somos chauvinistas, no somos nacionalistas estrechos. Somos patriotas, amamos nuestra patria. Respetamos y exaltamos los valores nacionales, pero nuestra filosofía fundamentalmente es la del internacionalismo. Luego estamos mucho mejor preparados que nadie para las integraciones. Nuestro pueblo, su educación política, lo hace más apto para cualquier paso en esta dirección.
Señor Presidente.
Next, we have James Connolly, a great Irish Republican, socialist and trade union leader who also recognized that nationalism must go hand in hand with socialism to bring about true liberation.
If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still rule you. She will rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs.
James Connolly, like Ho Chi Minh, urged the English working class to have international solidarity with Irish revolutionists and recognized that the division between Irish and English workers weakens the working class and strengthens capitalism.
Every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent. Hence, it is the task of the International everywhere to put the conflict between England and Ireland in the foreground and everywhere to side openly with Ireland. It is the special task of the Central Council in London to make the English workers realize that for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. However it may be for others, for us of the Citizen Army, there is but one ideal. An Ireland ruled and owned by Irish men and women, sovereign and independent from the center to the sea, and flying its own flag outward over all the oceans.
Wow, that sounds a lot like Ho Chi Minh's appeals to French workers to support the cause of Vietnamese independence. I hope by now you can understand why oppressed and colonized people all over the world have developed nationalism to build the path towards socialism and international unity. As long as strong, wealthy nations are able to colonize and oppress smaller, weaker nations, we will never have any hope for building international communism. This is why left-wing nationalism, indigenous nationalism, liberation nationalism will be critical towards building international unity and eventually abolishing class and states altogether to build the world all communists dream of. I will end my video with great words of Karl Marx, a beloved communist who, came up with Marxism. He said,
Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word.